slide, it's a little bit out of order. I really want to start down here with the definition of the power of the test. The definition of power is this. It is a probability, so it's the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when the alternative hypothesis is true. That is the definition. The probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when the alternative hypothesis is true. Now, a couple little things. Most of the time, you will not know what the power of the test is, but sometimes they will give you in a question the power of the test. But the definition is the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when the alternative hypothesis is true. So now, if we were to interpret the power of the test, we would want to say it like this. When we interpret it, we want to say that assuming that the proportion or the mean is blank, and so we are assuming that the alternative hypothesis is true. So really what needs to be said here is assuming that the true proportion is whatever the value is in the alternative hypothesis, or assuming that the true mean is whatever is in the alternative hypothesis. So in other words, assuming that the alternative hypothesis is true, there is a blank probability of finding convincing evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. And this blank is whatever percent we know, or whatever we're given for the power of the test. So if we are told that the power of the test is 80%, and we know that the alternative says that a particular proportion is greater than 25%, we would say, assuming that the true proportion is greater than 25%, there is an 80% probability of finding convincing evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. So that's the definition of the power of the test and also how to interpret the power of the test. Now, this little table over here goes back to type 1 and type 2 errors. And this is important to, this table is very, very useful. So let's take a look at how this table gets filled out. If the null hypothesis is true, and we reject, let's go this way. If the null hypothesis is true, and we fail to reject the null hypothesis, in other words, we support the null hypothesis, then we have made a correct decision and we haven't made any errors. So this is good. If the null hypothesis is false and we reject the null hypothesis, then once again, we have made a correct rejection. We have rejected the null hypothesis correctly. But these two combinations are errors. So if the null hypothesis is true and we reject it, we've made a mistake. And that type of mistake is called a type 1 error. Now, one thing I would like to add to this is that the probability of a type 1 error is equal to alpha. We talked about this in the last lesson, but I think it's important to maybe put this in this table as well. The probability of making a type 1 error is equal to alpha. So if the null hypothesis is true and we reject it, we've made a mistake, that's a type 1 error, and the probability of that happening is alpha. Well, if the null hypothesis is false, which by the way means that the alternative hypothesis is true, and we fail to reject the null hypothesis, then once again we've made a mistake. It's false, but we do not reject it. That is called a type 2 error. And once again, we learned that in our last lesson. But what about the probability of making a type 2 error? Well, the probability of making a type 2 error would be 1 minus the power of the test. Now, one thing to keep in mind, alpha, and sometimes this right here is this probability of type 2 error sometimes is called beta, but I won't get into that right now. The big thing to remember is this. Alpha plus the power of the test those are not equal to 1. So don't assume that they are. Okay, the power of the test is not 1 minus alpha. This is wrong. Okay, but sometimes students make that mistake and think that they are connected. Alpha is its own thing, and it is the probability of making a type 1 error, and the probability of making a type 2 error is equal to 1 minus the power of the test. Those are the big things that you need to get out of section 8.6. So hopefully this helps you understand some things, and hopefully you have a great day.